Hey, welcome back. I'm so glad you're here tonight, truly. If this is your first time finding this little corner of the internet, pull something warm around you, settle in properly, and just let the day go. You don't need to be anywhere else for the next few hours. And if you've been here before, you already know what we do here, so you know what to do. Get comfortable, get horizontal, if that's where you're headed. Let the room go soft. Before we begin, if tonight's story speaks to you, if something I say makes you pause, or makes you think about something differently, or makes you feel that particular quiet pleasure of learning something you genuinely didn't know, it would mean the world to me if you hit subscribe and left a like. It takes about 3 seconds, and it helps more than you know. And drop a comment telling me where you are in the world right now and what time it is where you're listening. I genuinely read those. I love knowing we're sharing this strange, quiet, late-night space together from different corners of the world. Now, dim whatever you can. Let the fan run soft if you've got one. Take one long breath, the kind where your shoulders actually drop, and let me take you somewhere. Picture a city, not a battlefield, not a palace, not a cathedral with gold leaf catching the morning light. Just a city, ordinary and loud and alive and, by our standards tonight, almost incomprehensibly different from anything we know. It is London, somewhere around the year 1740. The streets are narrow, the buildings lean toward each other overhead like old friends exchanging secrets. And the smell, well, the smell is something we are going to have to talk about honestly, because it is the whole beginning of the story. What did it smell like to be human in the 1700s? What did your body actually feel like, from the inside out, when soap was a luxury, when bathing was an event rather than a daily routine, when the gap between you and your own skin was mediated by layers of linen, wool, and a great deal of very particular customs that would strike us today as somewhere between fascinating and alarming? That is where we are going tonight. Not into the glamorous rooms of kings and queens, though they will make an appearance, and not into the polished world of the wealthy, though they will matter too. We are going into the ordinary body of the ordinary person, into the basin of cold water and the cake of hard soap, into the barbershop and the privy, into the river on a summer morning and the bed shared between too many people in winter, into the practices and rituals and strange, specific beliefs about cleanliness and filth and health and the body that governed daily life in the 18th century. Because here is the thing that will surprise you most by the time we reach the end of this story. The people of the 1700s were not simply dirty, careless, indifferent creatures who never thought about hygiene. They thought about it constantly. They had elaborate theories about it. They had rituals that were genuinely sophisticated and practices that we have quietly reinvented and are now calling revolutionary. They also had beliefs that were catastrophically wrong in ways that cost real human lives. And somewhere in the gap between their wisdom and their mistakes lies something that feels uncomfortably familiar, because the gap between what we believe about our own cleanliness and what is actually true is probably larger than any of us would comfortably admit. So pull that blanket up. Close your eyes if they want to close. Let the story do the work. We are stepping into the 1700s, and we are starting, as all honest stories about the human body must, at the very beginning. The skin. Your skin, in 1740, is not something you have a simple or straightforward relationship with. It is not, as we tend to think of it now, a surface to be maintained with a regular shower and a good moisturizer. It is, in the thinking of the time, something closer to a membrane, a living boundary between the inside of your body and the outside world, and what you do to that boundary matters enormously in ways that you understand through a framework of ideas that has nothing to do with bacteria or viruses or any of the invisible machinery that modern medicine will one day describe. You understand your skin through humors, through miasma, through the ancient inherited wisdom of Galen and Hippocrates, filtered through centuries of European medical tradition and deposited into the household knowledge of your mother and her mother before her. The body, in this understanding, is a system of balances. There is blood and phlegm and yellow bile and black bile, and these 4 substances in their proper proportions constitute health and in their imbalance constitute illness. The skin is a crucial site of this balance, because the skin sweats, and sweating is the body's primary mechanism for releasing what does not belong inside it. The bad humors, the accumulated excess, the internal corruption that builds up through the ordinary processes of being alive, all of this exits through the pores. This belief, which feels strange to us now, had a profound and lasting effect on how people thought about washing. And here is the part that stops people cold when they first encounter it. Many physicians in the early 18th century genuinely believed that washing the body with water, particularly cold water applied extensively to the skin, was dangerous, not merely uncomfortable, dangerous. The reasoning went like this. The pores of the skin are open channels. Water applied to these open channels could enter the body and carry with it whatever contamination existed in the water. Or alternatively, and this was the more popular version of the concern, extensive washing could close the pores, trapping inside the body the very humours and corruptions that the skin was working to expel. Seal the pores, and you have sealed the body's primary drainage system. The illness that was working its way out now has nowhere to go. You might think this sounds like fringe nonsense, the kind of belief held only by the ignorant, but it wasn't. It was mainstream medical opinion. It was endorsed by physicians who had spent years training. It was repeated in the medical texts that circulated through literate households, and it existed alongside genuinely sophisticated observations about health and illness that we have no reason to dismiss. These were not stupid people. They were people working with the best framework available to them, and the framework was wrong about this particular point in ways they had absolutely no way to know. So what did this belief produce in practice? It produced a culture of bodily care that looked very different from our own, but was not, at its core, a culture of neglect. The wealthy, the middling sorts, the working people, even the very poor, had their own versions of hygiene that made sense within this framework, that served real purposes, and that maintained real standards. Those standards just weren't our standards. Let us begin with linen. If you want to understand hygiene in the 1700s, you have to understand linen the way people of that time understood it, not as fabric, as a technology. Linen, the cloth woven from the fibers of the flax plant, had been the primary next-to-skin fabric of European civilization for centuries. It had qualities that people had observed over generations without being able to explain the mechanism behind them. It was smooth against the skin, so it chafed less than wool. It absorbed moisture readily, pulling sweat away from the body. It could be washed again and again at high temperature, boiled if necessary, and it survived. It whitened with washing and with sunlight, and that whiteness was visible and legible. Clean white linen was clean white linen. You could see it, you could smell it. You could hold it up to the light and make a judgment about whether it was acceptable. In a world without running water, without the ability to easily wash your actual body, linen did the work of cleanliness for you. The shirt against your skin was not just clothing. It was, in the understanding of the time, doing the cleaning. The linen absorbed the sweat and the shed skin and the oils of the body as you wore it, drawing them away from your flesh and into the fabric. When you changed your shirt, you were, in a very real sense, cleaning yourself. Not the washing with water cleaning that we understand, but a different kind of cleaning that made complete sense within the framework of ideas about pores and humours and what the body needed. A man of reasonable means in the 1740s might own perhaps a dozen shirts. He would change his shirt every day, or every other day if he was less prosperous. A shirt worn for several days without changing was a mark of poverty or neglect, in exactly the way that unwashed clothes read today. The accumulation of body soil in the linen was what cleanliness meant. Removing the soiled linen and replacing it with fresh was what maintaining yourself meant. Women wore a linen shift, also called a chemise, as the foundational layer of their clothing, next to the skin, beneath everything else. The shift was changed regularly, washed regularly, and represented the baseline of what it meant to be a clean woman. The elaborate outer garments, the gowns, the petticoats, the stays and stomachers, these were almost never washed in the way we understand washing. They couldn't be. They would be ruined. They were brushed and aired and spot-cleaned and carefully stored, and they lasted for years or decades. The shift was what got washed. The shift was the hygienic layer. This is why the expression clean linen carried so much social weight in the 18th century. When a visitor arrived at your home and you offered them a fresh shift or a clean shirt before dinner, you were offering them something real and meaningful. When a gentleman's collar was visibly fresh and white, that communicated something about his household and his household's habits. When a woman's cap, the linen covering that most women wore over their hair indoors, was clean and properly pressed, that was information about her. Linen was hygiene made visible, and linen required labour. Enormous, relentless, exhausting labour. Washing day, which happened roughly once a month, or sometimes once every several weeks in most households, was not a morning task. It was an event that lasted days, and it consumed the energy of every person in the household who could be pressed into service. Picture the process. The linens had to be sorted and counted, because in households where servants worked, the contents of the washing were carefully inventoried to prevent theft. The water had to be hauled, enormous quantities of it, from a well or a pump or a nearby water source. because nothing about this process was as simple as turning a tap. The water had to be heated in enormous kettles or copper vessels suspended over fires, and the sheer volume of hot water required for a thorough washing was staggering. The soap had to be prepared, and for most households in the early 18th century this meant soap that had been made at home in the autumn from rendered animal fat and wood ash lye. Home soap making was its own entire ritual world. The fat collected and saved throughout the year from every butchered animal, every skimmed pot, every rendered scrap, was melted together with lye made by leaching water through wood ash. The proportions were learnt by experience, because if the lye was too strong it destroyed the fabric and burnt the hands, and if it was too weak the soap didn't clean properly. Getting the soap right required the same kind of practiced, intuitive knowledge that we saw in the colonial kitchen, where the cook knew the temperature of the fire by how the bread sounded when she tapped it. The washing itself was physical labour of the most demanding kind. The linens were soaked and beaten and rubbed and boiled and rinsed. The boiling was not optional. It was the crucial step, because whatever beliefs people had or didn't have about the mechanisms of cleanliness, they knew from observation that boiling killed something. The linens that went through the boil came out smelling different, behaving differently. The connection between heat and what we would call sanitation was known even if it wasn't understood. After boiling came rinsing, in cold water, multiple times. Then wringing, which required strength and coordination and left hands red and aching. Then spreading, on grass or bushes or rope lines, depending on what was available, to dry and to bleach in the sunlight. Sunlight and fresh air were understood as cleansing forces in their own right, and a linen bleached white by a long sunny afternoon was genuinely cleaner in ways that would later be understood through the lens of ultraviolet radiation and bacterial death. The whole enterprise might take 2 or 3 daywoods from start to finish, and then, in a few weeks, it had to begin again. This is the context in which you have to understand 18th century hygiene, not as the absence of effort, but as a different distribution of effort, not as filth accepted passively, but as cleanliness defined differently, maintained at great cost, and understood through a framework that made complete internal sense. Now, let us talk about the body itself, because linen is only half the story. What did people actually do with their skin? The answer, it turns out, is more varied, more thoughtful, and in some ways more sophisticated than the popular image of the unwashed 18th century would suggest, and in other ways, considerably stranger. The face was the primary site of daily bodily attention for both men and women across almost all social classes. The face was visible, the face was the surface of social presentation. The face was where your health was read by others, where your character was assessed, where the first impression that would determine how people treated you was formed. So the face got washed. Not always with soap, sometimes just with water, cold water from a basin, applied with a cloth or with the bare hands, wiped dry with a clean linen cloth. Sometimes with a simple infusion, rose water or lavender water, or a preparation made from herbs that were understood to have specific properties, to refine the complexion, to treat redness, to keep the skin from drying out. The vocabulary of this kind of facial care would not be unfamiliar to anyone browsing a modern skincare aisle. The ingredients and the mechanisms of action were different, but the concern, the attention, the daily ritual of doing something to the face before you faced the world, that was not different at all. The hands received similar attention, and for practical reasons as much as cosmetic ones. In a world where your hands were doing physical work from morning to night, cooking and cleaning and digging and lifting and handling animals and tools and raw materials, keeping them in a state that wasn't actively offensive or painful was a genuine daily challenge. Rough, cracked, bleeding hands were painful and also dangerous, because cracks in the skin were understood, even within the miasma framework, as entry points for whatever corruption existed in the environment. So hands were washed and treated with simple preparations and protected when possible. The neck, the back of the neck, behind the ears, the creases under the jaw. These were areas that received attention in more careful households because they were areas where dirt and sweat accumulated and where the smell of a person who hadn't washed was most readily detectable. A clean neck was not just an aesthetic preference, it was a social signal, a declaration that you were paying attention to yourself. And then there was the rest of the body. For the majority of people in the 18th century, in Britain and in the American colonies and across most of Europe, the kind of immersive whole-body bathing that we consider a basic minimum, standing under a shower or submerging in a tub and washing every surface of the skin, happened rarely. Not never, but rarely. For some people, a full bath was a seasonal event. For others, Particularly among the poorer working population of cities, full immersion might happen when they swam in a river in summer, and not much beyond that. This was not shocking or unusual. It was simply the normal condition, given the practical difficulty of heating enough water, given the genuine medical beliefs about the risks of extensive washing, given the cost of soap and the scarcity of time. A servant or a factory worker or a farmer who worked from before sunrise to after dark 6 days a week was not going to prioritize the enormous logistical undertaking of a full bath when the change of linen was taking care of what mattered. But here is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the wealthy were doing something quite different. Among the aristocracy and the upper classes of 18th century Europe, particularly in France, a more complex and elaborate culture of bodily care had been developing since at least the late 17th century. It did not look like modern bathing, but it was far from nothing. The morning toilette, from the French word for a small cloth or covering, the original meaning of the word toilette, was a ritual that could take hours and involved a sequence of preparations for the body and face that were as carefully ordered as any other ceremony of upper-class life. Picture the bedroom of a wealthy man in Paris in the 1730s. He wakes. He does not immediately get up and go wash in a bathroom, because there is no bathroom in the modern sense. Instead, his valet brings him a basin and clean water and a cloth, and he performs what was called a dry washing, which is almost exactly what it sounds like: a thorough rubbing of the face, hands, and any other exposed skin with the cloth, possibly dampened, possibly treated with a small amount of some preparation. He might then have his face shaved by the valet or by a barber who comes to the house, and the shaving included the application of warm lather and careful attention to the skin of the face that constituted a kind of washing in itself. Then came the application of scent, and this is the part of aristocratic hygiene in the 18th century that has attracted the most historical attention, because it is so different from our own assumptions about what good grooming means. We assume that scent, in the modern world, is something you add to a clean body to make it more pleasant, a finishing touch, applied after you have already done the fundamental work of removing the body's natural odors through washing. In the 18th century, and particularly in the French aristocratic tradition that influenced most of Europe, the relationship between scent and cleanliness was more complicated than that. Scent was not merely cosmetic, it was understood as having genuine hygienic properties. Strong fragrances, particularly the heavy floral and animal musks and woody resins that were fashionable in the period, were believed to combat miasma, to protect the body against the corrupted air that was thought to cause illness. Scenting yourself was, in a real sense, protecting yourself. The perfumed pomade worked into a man's wig, the lavender water applied to a woman's skin, the rose and amber and civet carried in a small vinaigrette or pomander, these were not just frivolity, they were medicine. This belief had a long history. During the Black Death of the 14th century, physicians had carried pomanders, little balls of aromatic substances, to hold against their faces when they visited the sick, because they believed that the strong scent would block out the corrupted air that carried the disease. By the 18th century, that specific crisis was centuries past, but the underlying belief in the protective power of scent had never fully disappeared. It had just become domesticated, embedded in the daily practices of personal care, rather than carried as a medical emergency measure, which meant that a wealthy person in the 1730s who was heavily perfumed was not trying to mask unwashed odors in the way we might assume. They were performing a health practice. They were maintaining a scented layer between their body and a world they believed was full of dangerous air. The fact that it also smelled pleasant and communicated wealth and taste and sophistication was a bonus rather than the primary point. At least, that was the theory. In practice, of course, scent and cleanliness and social presentation were all tangled together in ways that are impossible to fully separate. A person who smelled like expensive French perfume was communicating expensive French perfume, regardless of the medical rationale behind its application. The fact that you could afford the scent mattered as much as what the scent was supposed to be doing. Among the working population, expensive perfumes were not an option, but the impulse toward pleasant smell, toward doing something to counter the natural odors of a body that was working hard in close proximity to other working bodies, was not entirely absent. Cheaper aromatic preparations, bundles of dried herbs kept in clothing, lavender sachets among stored linen, the smell of beeswax used to polish wood, all of these were part of how ordinary people managed their relationship with smell in the 18th century. And the hair. Let us spend a little time with the hair, because hair hygiene in the 1700s is one of the most misunderstood aspects of the entire subject. For men of the upper and middling classes in the early to mid-18th century, the hair question was largely answered by the wig, the periwig, which had been fashionable since the court of Louis XIV in the late 17th century, was at the height of its popularity in the first half of the 1700s. These were not small, neat accessories. Some of them were enormous constructions of human hair and horsehair, powdered white or grey, styled into elaborate peaks and curls, tied at the back with a black ribbon. They were expensive, they were status symbols, and they required their own regular maintenance, including periodic visits to the wig maker for restyling, cleaning, and repowdering. The powder that gave the wig its fashionable whiteness was typically made from starch, often scented with lavender or violet or orris root, and it was applied in large quantities, which is why wealthy households often had special rooms, powder rooms, where this operation could be carried out without coating everything else in the house with a fine white dust. The powder itself was not simply cosmetic. It was understood to absorb the oils and odors that accumulated in the wig during wear, performing, again, something of the same function that the clean linen shirt performed for the body. Underneath the wig, the actual head hair was cropped short, or sometimes shaved entirely, which had its own hygienic logic in an era when lice were an almost universal feature of human life, regardless of social class. Short hair under a wig was easier to manage, easier to clean, and offered fewer opportunities for the parasites that no one entirely escaped. For women, whose own elaborate hairstyles, particularly later in the century, could reach astonishing heights of powdered and padded and feathered construction, the situation was even more complicated. The great towering hairstyles of the 1770s and 1780s, which could stand 2 feet above the crown of the head and were supported by wire frames and padding and paste and layers of built-up hair and false additions, were not things you dismantled every night. They were maintained for days or weeks at a time, sleeping carefully to preserve them, perhaps touching them up as needed. The consequences for the scalp and the underlying hair of this kind of arrangement were, let us say, complex. This is a topic we will return to, but let us step back from the aristocracy for a moment, because they represent a small slice of the population we're spending the evening with. Let us go to where most people actually lived: the cities, the towns, the market towns and the working neighbourhoods, and the close-packed streets where ordinary life happened. London in the mid-18th century had a population approaching 1 million people. It was, at that point, the largest city in the Western world, and the question of how 1 million people managed their basic bodily functions in a space that had been built for far fewer, without sewage systems as we understand them, without running water in most homes, without the infrastructure of cleanliness that we now consider the baseline minimum, is one of the most fascinating and genuinely difficult stories in the history of the human body. Let us start with water, because everything about hygiene in this period flows from the question of water access. Getting water in 18th century London was not simple. For the wealthy few, private water supplies could be arranged through the water companies that had been developing since the 17th century, piping water from the Thames or from other sources through wooden pipes to pumps in the basements of grand houses. But even this was intermittent, and the water itself was not clean in any modern sense. For the great majority of Londoners, water came from public pumps, from wells, from the Thames directly, or from the water carriers who walked the streets with their barrels and sold water by the bucketful. A water carrier in early 18th century London was a fixture of urban life, as ordinary and essential as any other tradesperson. And the water they sold was whatever water they could get, from the river that was also receiving the city's waste, from wells that were sometimes separated from nearby privies by distances that provided no real protection. The relationship between water and disease, the specific mechanism by which contaminated water transmitted cholera and typhoid and dysentery, was not understood until the 19th century. John Snow's famous work, identifying the Broad Street pump as the source of a cholera outbreak, happened in 1854. Before that, the miasma theory held that disease travelled through air, not water, which meant there was no particular reason, within the prevailing medical understanding, to worry about the purity of water you were using for washing, as opposed to the purity of the air you were breathing. This is one of the places where being wrong had the most catastrophic consequences. But let us not get ahead of ourselves. The London we're spending the evening in is 1740, and the people living in it are managing as best they can within what they know. The pump in the street or the court was where most people got their washing water. You went to the pump with your bucket, you pumped, you carried the bucket home, you used the water for whatever the day required, and you went back to the pump when you needed more. In a city of close-packed buildings and crowded courts and alleys, the pump might be 20 yards from your door, or it might be half a street away. Either way, every drop of water that entered your home had been carried there by human muscle. This is why water was used carefully. This is why a full bath required a level of planning and effort that most people simply did not invest in their ordinary week. It is not that they didn't value cleanliness. It is that the infrastructure of cleanliness that we take for granted, the turning of a tap, the immediate availability of hot or cold water at any moment, was simply not there. So what did the ordinary Londoner actually do? They washed their face and hands at the start of the day, with whatever water was available. They changed their linen when it needed changing, which in prosperous households was frequently, and in poor households was when they had a clean shirt to change into. They went to the barber, which was an institution of enormous social importance that we will spend considerable time on shortly, and they lived in a body that smelled, by our standards, different from anything we encounter in our ordinary lives today. The smell of the 18th century city is something that historians return to again and again, because it is one of the hardest things to convey and one of the most important things to understand. It was not simply the smell of unwashed people, though that was part of it. It was the smell of a city that had no effective sewage system, where human and animal waste was managed through a combination of privies and cesspits, and simply throwing things into the street, where dead animals were not immediately removed, where the river received everything that the city produced and sent it downstream to the next city, where coal fires burned through every winter and laid a fine greasy soot on every surface and into every pair of lungs. The historian Alain Corbin, in his remarkable study of odour and the French social imagination in the 18th and 19th centuries, argued that the history of smell is inseparable from the history of civilization itself, that the ongoing project of controlling, managing, relocating, and eventually eliminating the smells of the body and the city is one of the defining stories of modern culture. He traced how, over the course of the 18th century, attitudes towards smell began to shift, how the tolerance for certain kinds of smell, the animal smells of the body, the organic smell of urban waste, began to narrow, how sensitivity increased, how the demand for olfactory cleanliness began to grow. This shift is visible in the 18th century, even as the actual capacity to meet the new standards was still limited. People were beginning to want something different. The wanting came before the infrastructure to deliver it. But we are getting ahead of ourselves again. Let us go to the barber, because the barbershop of the 18th century is, I think, one of the most revealing and underappreciated sites of hygiene and social life in the period, and it deserves its own careful attention. The barber in the 1700s was not simply the person who cut your hair. The barber was a healthcare provider. The tradition of the barber surgeon, which had deep roots in medieval European culture, was still alive in modified form in the 18th century. The separation of surgery from barbering had been formally enacted in England in 1745, when surgeons finally obtained their own separate professional charter. But in practice, the overlap between the barber's services and what we might call basic medical care remained significant for decades afterward. What did a barber actually do in the 1740s? He shaved. Shaving with a straight razor was not a skill that most men had or wanted to develop at home, partly because razors required constant professional maintenance to stay truly sharp, and partly because being shaved by someone else, properly, with warm water and good lather, was a significant everyday pleasure in a world that offered relatively few such pleasures. A man might go to the barber 2 or 3 times a week for a shave, sitting in the barber's chair in a shop that was also one of the primary social gathering places of the neighbourhood, a place to hear news and gossip and opinions, to encounter people you might not otherwise see, to spend 20 minutes in the warm social blur of other men talking. He also cut and dressed the hair, for those men who wore their own hair rather than a wig. By the later decades of the century, as the fashion for wigs began to decline, this part of the barber's work became more important. Hair cutting and dressing was a skilled craft, and the best barbers were gentlemen of craft who commanded real respect. He might also offer tooth pulling, which he performed not because he had any particular training in dentistry, but because he had the basic surgical tools and the manual dexterity and the willingness to do something unpleasant. Tooth pulling in the 18th century was what it sounds like: a pair of forceps, a strong grip, and considerable pain for the patient. There was no anesthesia, there was no cleaning of the wound afterward in any effective sense. There was just the extraction, and then the bleeding, and then the recovery, which sometimes went well and sometimes did not. Some barbers still practiced bloodletting, the ancient therapeutic practice of opening a vein to release what the humoral theory understood as excess blood or other humours that were causing illness. Bloodletting was performed with a lancet, a small sharp blade, or with leeches, which were kept in jars and applied to the skin to do their slow work. By the mid-18th century, the medical consensus on bloodletting was beginning to shift, with increasing numbers of physicians questioning its value, but the practice remained common enough that it was still regularly offered in barbershops, and still regularly requested by patients who believed in it. The barbershop smelled of soap, good soap, scented if the barber had ambitions, plain if he didn't. But the regular application of lather for shaving meant that the barbershop was one of the few spaces in an ordinary neighborhood where the smell of clean soap was consistently present. It was also warm, heated by a fire year-round, because warm water for shaving was not optional, it was part of the service. And it was, in the way of spaces that combined physical care with social gathering, one of the genuinely pleasant places in the landscape of 18th century urban life. For the women of the neighborhood, there was no equivalent public space of this kind. The care of a woman's hair and skin happened at home, or with the help of other women, or for the wealthy, with the services of a lady's maid, the maid who brushed and dressed her mistress's hair, who helped with the elaborate preparations of the morning toilette, was performing services that had a direct parallel to the barber's work, but without the public social dimension that the barbershop provided. Now, let us talk about something that everyone of the 18th century did and that nobody talked about openly in polite company. The management of the natural processes of the body, the privy, the chamber pot, the cesspit, the river, and what all of that meant for the smell and the health of the 18th century world. Every human body produces waste. That is not a revelation. But what you do with that waste, how you manage it, where it goes, who is responsible for moving it, and what happens to the land and water and air around the places where it accumulates, those are questions whose answers define much of the character of any civilization. In the 18th century, in Britain and in the American colonies, the primary tool for managing human waste in an ordinary household was the privy, also called the outhouse, the necessary house, the house of office, or by any number of more colourful informal names. A small wooden structure over a pit, located as far from the house as possible while remaining accessible, emptied periodically by the night soil men whose work was as essential as it was unglamorous, and whose contribution to urban life was almost entirely unacknowledged. In cities, where space did not allow for privies at a meaningful distance from houses, shared privies in courts and alleys served multiple households simultaneously. A single privy might serve 20 or 30 families. The conditions of these shared facilities were, by any reasonable assessment, deeply unpleasant, often dangerous, and a source of ongoing social tension between the neighbours who shared them and the landlords who were supposed to maintain them. Inside the house, particularly at night, the chamber pot served the function that a bathroom now serves. It sat under the bed or in a corner of the bedroom, and it was emptied every morning, its contents carried to the privy, or, in cities where privies were distant or inadequate, sometimes simply thrown from a window into the street with a warning cry that became a recognised part of the urban soundscape. The emptying of chamber pots was assigned, in most households, to the servants, where servants existed, or to whoever was on the lowest rung of the domestic hierarchy. It was not a task that anyone sought out. It was simply one of the 100 unglamorous necessities that kept a household functioning, performed every day without comment and without particular acknowledgement. The cesspit beneath the privy required periodic emptying, and this was the work of the night soil men, whose profession was as old as cities themselves. They came at night, because the smell of opening and excavating a cesspit that hadn't been emptied in months was sufficiently powerful that doing it during the day would have been unbearable for the surrounding neighbourhood. They came with carts and buckets and strong backs and, one imagines, a certain professional detachment from the nature of their work. They took the contents to dumps outside the city, or sold it to farmers who used it as fertilizer, which it genuinely was, and which represented, in a strange way, one of the more effective recycling operations of the era. The night soil men were not well compensated for their essential service, and they were not well regarded socially, despite the fact that without them the cities of the 18th century would have been uninhabitable within weeks. Their work was invisible in the precise way that all genuinely essential labour tends to be invisible, noticed only when it stops. But let us not stay too long in the privy, because there are other aspects of this story that deserve attention, and we have a lot of territory to cover before the night is through. Let us talk about teeth. Dental care in the 18th century is a subject that manages to be simultaneously fascinating, horrifying, and surprisingly relevant to our own world, because some of what people did for their teeth in the 1700s was more sophisticated than you might expect, and some of it was exactly as bad as you're imagining. The toothbrush, as a recognizable object, had existed in various forms since at least the late 17th century in Europe, having arrived from China, where a version using animal bristles had been used for considerably longer. By the 18th century, bone-handled toothbrushes with animal bristles, typically from hogs, were available to those who could afford them and inclined to use them. For those who couldn't afford a proper toothbrush, a piece of rough cloth or even a twig from certain trees served the same basic function of mechanically cleaning the surface of the teeth. What you put on the toothbrush, or the cloth, or the twig, was another matter entirely. The tooth powders and tooth preparations of the 18th century ranged from the genuinely useful to the actively harmful, sometimes within the same recipe. Charcoal powder was common, and it worked, more or less. Charcoal is mildly abrasive and has some absorptive properties that probably helped with basic surface staining. Salt was used, and also worked reasonably well as a mild abrasive. Ground chalk was popular, and similarly effective for basic cleaning. But some preparations included ingredients that caused real damage. Powdered brick, used because it was abrasive and cheap, was hard enough to scratch and wear the enamel of the teeth over time. Some preparations included acidic ingredients intended to whiten the teeth, which they did, temporarily, by etching the enamel surface, leaving it more porous and vulnerable. The 18th century's desire for white teeth, which was genuine and widespread across social classes, led people to apply things to their teeth that were more destructive than the staining they were trying to remove. And then there was sugar. The 18th century was the period during which sugar went from being an expensive luxury to being a widely affordable commodity, as the plantation economies of the Caribbean expanded and the price dropped. For most of human history, the human diet had contained relatively little refined sugar, and the human mouth had evolved in that context. The introduction of cheap sugar into the everyday diet of ordinary people across Britain and its colonies had consequences that were visible in the mouths of people of every class by the mid-century. Tooth decay was epidemic. It was not unusual for a person in their 30s or 40s to have lost most of their teeth. It was not unusual for people much younger than that to have significant dental problems. The wealthy were, if anything, worse off in this regard than the poor, because they could afford more sugar, and sugar was the problem. Samuel Johnson, who lived from 1709 to 1784 and was one of the most brilliant minds of the 18th century, suffered from severe dental problems throughout his adult life. George Washington's famously difficult relationship with his teeth is well documented, and he was not unusual among men of his class. The treatment for a bad tooth, as we touched on briefly when we were in the barbershop, was extraction. There was nothing else. There was no filling, no root canal, no crown, none of the tools of modern dentistry that might save a damaged tooth. If the tooth was causing sufficient pain, it came out. This was a procedure performed without anesthesia of any kind except possibly alcohol, and the pain of it was significant enough that people sometimes avoided it, even when their suffering from the untreated tooth was considerable. The fear of the extraction kept people living with abscesses and infections that could, and sometimes did, become life-threatening. The gums that housed the remaining teeth received some attention in the form of tooth powders and preparations that were believed to strengthen and protect them. Some of these were herbal, and some herbs genuinely do have mild antimicrobial properties that would have provided some benefit. But the underlying cause of most gum disease, the accumulation of bacterial plaque that the body responds to with inflammation, was not understood, and so the treatments addressed symptoms rather than causes. There was also a class of itinerant tooth dealers who operated at fairs and markets, offering tooth extraction and the sale of replacement teeth, sometimes in the form of simple carved ivory or bone prosthetics, and sometimes in the form of teeth extracted from other mouths. The practice of using human teeth as replacement teeth, transplanted from one mouth to another or fitted into dentures, was more common in the 18th century than anyone is entirely comfortable thinking about. The teeth might come from the poor, who sold them for small amounts of money. They might come from executed criminals. By the end of the century and into the early 19th, they would notoriously come from battlefields, where soldiers' teeth were harvested after battles and sent to dentists who used them in dentures for the wealthy. None of this worked well. Transplanted teeth were rejected by the body. Dentures made from human teeth did not fit well and decayed in the wearer's mouth. But the desire for something that functioned like teeth was powerful, and people tried what was available. Let us move away from the teeth and return to something slightly more pleasant. Let us talk about the skin again, but this time in the context of the cosmetics and preparations that people actually used and what they were hoping to achieve. The relationship between cosmetics and cleanliness in the 18th century is complicated by the fact that we now draw a fairly sharp line between the two, a line that did not quite exist in the same way in the 1700s. Cosmetics were sometimes understood as hygiene. The preparations you applied to your skin were serving multiple purposes simultaneously, protecting it, treating it, improving its appearance, and communicating something about your status and your attention to yourself. Among women of the upper and middling classes, the application of something to the face was entirely normal and widely practiced, though not universally admitted. The official social position, at least in England, was that respectable women did not wear artificial colour on their faces, that the rosy cheek of health and virtue was natural and unassisted. The actual practice was quite different. The white lead paste that was used as a face powder, the carmine or cochineal that provided colour, the preparations that defined brows and lips, these were used widely, quietly, and without much acknowledgement in polite company. The white lead that formed the base of fashionable face paint is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it represents one of the most consistently repeated and most genuinely tragic examples of the gap between desire and knowledge in 18th century hygiene. Lead had been used in cosmetics since ancient Rome. Ceruse, a preparation of white lead, was the standard base for fashionable white-faced makeup across the early modern period and well into the 18th century. It went on smoothly, it covered the skin uniformly, it had a particular luminosity that women found attractive, and it was slowly poisonous. Not dramatically, quickly poisonous, in the way that a single dose of arsenic would be. Slowly, insidiously, cumulatively poisonous, in the way that a substance absorbed through the skin and accumulated in the body over months and years produces symptoms that are initially mysterious and increasingly debilitating. Hair loss, skin damage, neurological symptoms, pallor, which was ironic, given that pallor was precisely the look the lead paint was meant to achieve. Eventually, in cases of severe long-term exposure, death. The physicians of the 18th century were not entirely ignorant of these effects. There were medical texts that warned about the dangers of lead-based cosmetics. There were physicians who published their concerns, but the information moved slowly, the awareness was incomplete, and the fashion was powerful. People continued to use cerise because it worked, in the narrow cosmetic sense, and because the connection between what you put on your face and the deterioration of your health years later was not something that anyone had a clear framework for understanding. Fairness of skin, in the 18th century, carried enormous social weight. Pale skin was the skin of people who did not work outdoors, which meant it was the skin of wealth and leisure. A tan was the mark of labour, of being outside, of being lower on the social scale. This meant that the desire for white skin was not merely aesthetic, it was bound up with class aspiration, with the desire to appear to belong to a category of people who were more comfortable and more powerful than you actually were. And so people reached for preparations that delivered the appearance they wanted, without fully understanding the price. This was not stupidity. It was the normal human response to the existence of something that worked in the short term, in the context of incomplete information about its long-term effects. We do versions of this all the time. Alongside the lead-based preparations, there was a much larger world of cosmetic and skincare products that were genuinely harmless and sometimes genuinely beneficial. The tradition of making simple preparations at home from available ingredients, the cucumber water and rose water and almond oil and beeswax that we spent time with in our earlier conversation about Victorian hygiene, was already well established in the 18th century and formed the practical core of most women's skincare routines. The household recipe book, that document we encountered in the colonial world, where medical preparations sat alongside cooking recipes and household management tips, was full of recipes for face creams and hand lotions and hair preparations and tooth powders that drew on accumulated herbal and domestic knowledge. Some of these were quite good. A preparation of beeswax, almond oil, and rose water is essentially the cold cream recipe that has survived into the 21st century. Glycerin-based preparations for rough hands are similarly sensible. Lavender water, which was used for everything from cleaning the face to scenting the linen to treating headaches to freshening a room, is antiseptic in ways that were observed without being understood, and its antimicrobial properties are genuine, even if the miasma framework used to explain them was wrong. The history of cosmetics and skincare in the 18th century is really the history of women solving practical problems with available resources within a framework of ideas about the body that was partially correct and partially not, recording their solutions in household books and passing them to their daughters, maintaining a tradition of practical knowledge about the skin that outlasted the specific theories that had originally motivated it. Now let us talk about something that is, in some ways, the central practical challenge of hygiene in the 1700s, and that connects everything else we have been discussing, the question of smell, not the smell of the city, which we touched on earlier, the smell of the individual body, managed or not managed, within the constraints of the available resources and the prevailing beliefs. The 18th century had a relationship with body smell that was not, as is sometimes assumed, one of simple acceptance or indifference. People of the period were acutely aware of smell. They had a vocabulary for it that was extensive and nuanced. They had opinions about which smells were tolerable and which were not, which smells indicated health and which indicated illness, which smells were the natural product of a healthy body and which were the product of something going wrong. The smell of sweat was not in itself considered offensive or problematic in the way that it is today. Sweat was understood as the natural product of the body's cleansing process, the humors exiting through the skin, and a person who was working hard and sweating freely was in some respects displaying a positive sign of bodily health. The laborer who came home smelling of a day's work was not failing a hygienic standard in the way that the same smell would be judged today. What was considered offensive, and genuinely was considered offensive by people at all levels of 18th century society, was the smell that came from a body or from clothing that had not been managed at all, the smell of old sweat in fabric that hadn't been washed for extended periods, the smell of illness, which is genuinely different and genuinely unpleasant, the smell of dental disease, the smell of wounds that were not healing well. These were recognized as signs of something wrong, as failures of the management that every person was expected to perform on their own body. The distinction between these categories, between the natural smell of a working body and the smell of genuine neglect or illness, was one that people in the 18th century were probably quite good at making, much better at making than we are in fact, because their sensory world was much more heavily populated with smell than ours is. We live in a world where most organic smells have been reduced, managed away, replaced with artificial fragrances. Our olfactory sensitivity has, in a real sense, atrophied. The 18th century person, navigating a world full of different smells from different sources, was probably a much more acute reader of what those smells meant. The management of body smell in the 18th century relied primarily on linen, as we've discussed. The clean shirt did the heavy lifting, but there were also specific preparations applied to the armpits and other areas prone to strong odor. Vinegar was used, rubbed into the armpits, and this was not as absurd as it sounds. The acidity of vinegar creates an environment that is genuinely hostile to the bacteria responsible for the conversion of sweat into the organic compounds that smell most strongly. It wasn't as effective as a modern deodorant, but it was doing something real. For the majority of the population who could not afford trips to the seaside, the equivalent, when the weather and the proximity of water allowed, was swimming in rivers and ponds, which was common especially among men and boys, and which provided the same basic experience of full body immersion in cold water that the wealthy were paying fashionable physicians to recommend. There is a lovely detail in the biography of Benjamin Franklin, who was perhaps the most enthusiastic swimmer of the American founding generation, that he taught himself to swim as a child in the Schuylkill River near Philadelphia and remained an advocate of swimming and cold water bathing throughout his long life. He proposed at one point, while living in London in the 1720s, that he could make his fortune as a swimming instructor to the sons of the English gentry. He was probably right. The proposal never came to anything, but the image it conjures, Franklin in the Thames teaching aristocratic young men to swim, is both charming and revealing because it captures the genuinely democratic appeal of cold water as a hygienic and physical practice that required no special resources beyond access to water. Let us now turn to something that cuts across all of the categories we've been discussing, something that shaped the hygiene of every person in the 18th century, regardless of their wealth or their class or their specific practices: the role of disease. Because hygiene does not exist in a vacuum, it exists in a world of illness, and the relationship between the two, the ways in which certain hygienic practices prevent disease and others accidentally facilitate it, and the ways in which the experience of disease shaped what people believed about cleanliness and the body, is the deepest thread running through this entire story. The diseases that shaped 18th century life were a fearsome catalogue: smallpox, typhoid fever, dysentery, tuberculosis, then called consumption, malaria, then called ague, which afflicted much of England and the American colonies in certain seasons, plague, which had been the great catastrophe of the previous centuries and still appeared in periodic outbreaks in parts of Europe through the 18th century, scarlet fever, measles, diphtheria, which we touched on in the colonial context, that killer of children. Each of these diseases had its own specific relationship with hygiene, its own specific mechanism of transmission that was partly understood and partly entirely opaque. And the 18th century's response to disease, shaped by its framework of humors and miasma and the body's balances, was a mixture of some genuinely effective practices and some deeply counterproductive ones. Smallpox is perhaps the most important disease to spend time with, because the 18th century's encounter with smallpox produced the first genuinely successful intervention in the history of infectious disease, inoculation. Smallpox was a disease that had been with humanity for millennia, and by the 18th century it was endemic in Europe, meaning it was present more or less continuously, with epidemic spikes of particular severity that could kill enormous numbers of people in a short period. In England, it is estimated that in the early 18th century, smallpox was responsible for roughly 10% of all deaths, and a significantly higher proportion of deaths among children. The disease was genuinely terrifying because of the way it disfigured as well as killed. Survivors of smallpox often carried its marks for the rest of their lives, deep pitted scars across the face and body, sometimes blindness, sometimes other permanent damage. The fear of smallpox was not abstract. It was a daily reality for every person living in the 18th century, visible in the faces of the people around them who had already survived it. The practice of inoculation against smallpox was brought to Europe from the Ottoman Empire in the early 18th century through the remarkable advocacy of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who had encountered the practice in Constantinople while accompanying her husband on a diplomatic mission. Montagu had herself survived smallpox with significant scarring. When she observed the Ottoman practice of deliberately infecting people with material from smallpox pustules to induce a mild version of the disease and subsequent immunity, she was immediately convinced of its value and had her own children inoculated. On her return to England in 1721, she campaigned vigorously for the adoption of the practice, and it was tested first on condemned prisoners in one of the more ethically complicated episodes of medical history, and then on members of the royal family, which gave it the royal endorsement that made it fashionable among the aristocracy. The practice spread, unevenly, contested, with genuine risks attached to it, because inoculation with actual smallpox material did sometimes produce a real case of smallpox that could be severe or fatal. But it also worked, often enough and clearly enough, that it represented a genuine departure from the previous helplessness in the face of the disease, and it established a principle, the principle of using exposure to a pathogen to generate immunity to it, that would eventually become the basis of modern vaccination when Edward Jenner demonstrated the safer cowpox-based version in 1796. What does smallpox have to do with hygiene? More than you might immediately think. The management of smallpox cases at home, the care of the sick person, the isolation of the household during illness, the handling of bedding and clothing and other materials that had been in contact with the sick were all aspects of the daily management of a disease that every family could expect to encounter. And the practices around this management, shaped by the miasma theory that said bad air was the primary vector of infection, produced behaviors that sometimes accidentally helped and sometimes didn't. Fumigation, the burning of aromatic materials in a sick room to purify the air, was standard practice. Burning juniper, or other strongly scented wood, or sulfur, which we know is genuinely antimicrobial, was done in the belief that the smoke would drive out the corrupted miasma. The sulfur fumigation probably did have some real effect, even if for the wrong reasons. The isolation of the sick person, which was practiced in some form, was sensible regardless of whether you understood that smallpox was transmitted person to person through respiratory droplets. The airing of sick rooms after recovery, the washing of bedding, the burning of material that was too contaminated to clean, these practices, when they occurred, were doing real work even within an incorrect explanatory framework. Let us now spend a little time with something that I find genuinely one of the most interesting and most underappreciated aspects of 18th century hygiene: the spa. Not the modern-day spa in the contemporary sense. The actual spa, the place where mineral waters emerged from the earth, and where the practice of drinking and bathing in these waters developed into one of the great social institutions of the century. Bath, in Somerset, England, was the most famous of these. The hot springs at Bath had been known since Roman times, and the Romans had built a substantial bathing complex there. In the 18th century, Bath was transformed by a series of remarkable building projects and social entrepreneurs into the most fashionable resort in England, a place where the aristocracy and the gentry and the upper professional classes went for health and for pleasure, and where the two were deliberately and cleverly intertwined. The waters at Bath were drunk, and they were bathed in. The bathing happened in the King's Bath and the Queen's Bath, and other pools fed by the natural springs, and it was done in something very like public, with male and female bathers in the same water at certain hours, separated at other hours, wearing the heavy flannel garments that were considered appropriate bathing dress, and conducting social interactions in the water that would have been impossible in most other settings of the period. Richard Nash, known as Beau Nash, served as the master of ceremonies at Bath from 1705 until his death in 1761, and his genius lay in creating a social framework that made Bath accessible to a broad range of social levels while maintaining just enough order and prestige to keep the most fashionable people interested. He established rules for behavior, arbitrated social disputes, and managed the delicate balance between exclusivity and commerce that made Bath what it was. The water itself, the mineral springs, was understood in ways that mixed genuine observation with considerable wishful thinking. The high mineral content of the water was real, and drinking mineral-rich water might well have provided benefits to people whose ordinary diets were deficient in certain minerals. The heat of the spring water was real, and bathing in warm water has genuine effects on muscle tension and circulation that would have been experienced regardless of the explanatory framework. But the specific claims made for the curative powers of the waters, that they could cure gout and rheumatism and skin diseases and melancholy and infertility and 100 other conditions, went considerably beyond what the evidence actually supported. What Bath offered, beyond the water itself, was everything that surrounded the water. Fresh air, relative to the cities most visitors came from. Exercise, in the form of the walks through the elegant streets and parks that Nash and his successors had built. A regulated social environment where behavior was monitored and certain kinds of excess were discouraged. Regular hours, meals at consistent times, sleep at consistent hours. A temporary removal from the anxieties and pressures of ordinary life. These things, which have nothing specifically to do with mineral water, were probably genuinely beneficial for people who arrived exhausted and overstressed from the demands of wealthy 18th century life. The spa model was replicated across Europe. Germany had its Bad Ems and Bad Homburg. France had Vichy. The American colonies developed their own versions, with springs in New York and Virginia and Pennsylvania attracting visitors who sought the fashionable and therapeutic combination that Bath had made famous. And the spa, in all of these forms, was doing something interesting for the history of hygiene, which is this. It was providing a space where the immersive bathing of the body was legitimate, prescribed, and desirable for people who might not otherwise have considered it their regular practice. The person who would not ordinarily have arranged a hot bath at home because of the effort involved and the uncertain medical status of the procedure could at a spa bathe daily in warm mineral water on medical advice and feel that they were doing something healthful rather than indulgent. The spa made bathing respectable. This matters because the 18th century is the period in which the social meaning of regular bathing began to shift, slowly, unevenly, in different ways for different classes, towards something closer to what we now understand by the term. The spa was one of the mechanisms of that shift. Let us talk about one more aspect of 18th century hygiene that deserves attention before we begin to draw the threads together. The management of the hair, which is really a story about parasites, and which is one of the more honest conversations we can have about the reality of life in the 1700s. Head lice, body lice. The parasites that lived in human hair and clothing were not a marginal phenomenon in the 18th century. They were a near universal feature of human life at every level of society. The belief that lice were a problem only of the poor and the dirty was not well supported by the evidence. Lice were found in the wigs of aristocrats and in the shifts of servants. They infested army camps and school dormitories and the beds of respectable households. They were a simple fact of life in a world where people lived in close physical proximity to each other and to animals. This is one of the places where the history of hygiene challenges our comfortable assumptions most directly. We tend to associate lice with failure of cleanliness, with something that happens to people who don't take care of themselves. But in the 18th century, they happened to everyone because the mechanisms for preventing them, the temperature washing of clothing that kills lice and eggs, the regular washing of the body and the hair, the physical separation of beds and bedding between individuals, were not consistently available to most people regardless of their intentions. The management of lice was consequently a routine domestic task rather than an emergency response. The fine-toothed comb, the knit comb, was a standard item in every household kit. Running the comb through the hair and through the seams of clothing, where body lice clustered, was done regularly, and it was effective at reducing the population of parasites even if it couldn't eliminate them entirely. The fashion for wigs among men of the upper classes had, as one of its unspoken advantages, the fact that the close-cropped or shaved head under a wig was easier to maintain free of lice than a full head of natural hair. The wig itself could be sent to the wigmaker periodically for cleaning, which involved processes that killed any lice that had established themselves in it. This wasn't the primary motivation for wearing wigs, but it was a real practical benefit. The elaborate hairstyles of women in the later 18th century, those towering powdered constructions of the 1770s and 1780s, presented a different situation. These hairstyles were not wigs, though they often incorporated false hair. They were the woman's own hair, built up into elaborate forms with the help of wire supports and padding and oils and pomades that stiffened and held the structure. They were maintained for days or weeks at a time. The consequences for the scalp of not being able to wash or thoroughly comb the hair for extended periods were significant, and historical sources from the period make passing reference to the scratching that accompanied the wearing of these styles in ways that suggest parasites were a well-understood occupational hazard of high fashion. Special long-handled scratching tools were sold for exactly this purpose, allowing a woman to reach her scalp without disturbing the architecture of her hair. The powder that was applied to these hairstyles, in quantities large enough to turn the hair white, was starch, and starch, piled on a warm head in an urban environment, attracted insects of other kinds as well. There are accounts in the historical record of mice nesting in the very largest examples of these hairstyles, accounts that may be exaggerated for comic effect, but that reflect a genuine anxiety about what might be happening in the unexplored depths of a hairstyle that had been in place for a fortnight. The abandonment of extreme powdered hairstyles in the last decade of the 18th century, which happened for a variety of reasons including fashion change and political association of the style with the Ancien regime in the aftermath of the French Revolution, had, as an incidental benefit, a reduction in the domestic labor involved in maintaining these constructions and, probably, some improvement in the management of whatever had been living in them. The end of the wig fashion for men, which was similarly underway by the 1790s and essentially complete by 1800 for most classes outside of certain professional contexts, like the legal profession, where wigs have survived into the present, meant that men's hair management returned to a more direct and manageable form. The short natural hairstyle that replaced the wig required regular cutting and could be washed more easily than a wig could, though the frequency with which men actually washed their hair was still considerably less than modern practice. Now, as this long evening draws toward its close, I want to spend a little time on the way the 18th century ended, hygienically speaking, and what was beginning to change, because the world we have been describing, the world of linen and cold water and barbers and miasma and chamber pots and night soil men, was already beginning to shift in the last decades of the century in ways that would, over the following 100 years, transform the material conditions of bodily care almost beyond recognition. The change was driven by several things happening simultaneously. There was the development of running water infrastructure in cities, beginning with experiments in the mid-18th century and becoming more substantial toward the end of the century. The ability to get water to individual houses, even intermittently, even at low pressure, began to change the practical calculus of washing in ways that the previous generations had not been able to experience. Water that didn't have to be carried was water that could be used more freely. There was the beginning of a shift in medical thinking, away from the humoral theory and the miasma model toward a more empirical, observation-based understanding of disease. This shift was slow and contested, and is usually dated to the 19th century rather than the 18th, but its roots were in the 18th century scientific revolution, and in the work of physicians and natural philosophers who were beginning to look more carefully at what actually happened in specific conditions, rather than what the inherited theory said should happen. There was the beginning of a soap industry, moving soap production from the domestic space of the autumn soap-making session into commercial production that could supply soap to households that hadn't made their own. Soap taxes in Britain, which had been in place since 1712, kept commercial soap expensive and therefore somewhat limited its accessibility, and these taxes weren't repealed until 1853. But the commercial production of soap was already underway and already affecting the availability of the product. There was the Enlightenment's general investment in reason, in observation, in the idea that the natural world operated according to discoverable principles, and that human practice could be improved by understanding those principles. Applied to hygiene, this produced an increasing interest in what actually worked, rather than simply what was traditionally done, and an increasing willingness to experiment with new practices and new products. There was also, and this is harder to trace but no less real, a shift in sensibility, a change in what people found tolerable and intolerable, a narrowing of the range of smell and appearance and bodily condition that was accepted as normal. The historian Norbert Elias described this as the civilizing process, the long historical project of gradually imposing more and more restraint on bodily functions and bodily expression in social settings, pushing the gross and the animal and the unavoidably physical further and further out of public view. This process was not smooth or uniform or without contradiction, but it was real, and the 18th century was a significant period in its development. The combination of these forces, the improving infrastructure, the shifting medicine, the growing soap industry, the Enlightenment investment in practical improvement, and the changing cultural sensibility, was already producing something new by the last decade of the 18th century. The world that the next century would inherit was already different from the world of 1740. The change was gathering, even if its full force would not be felt for decades. And here is the thing I want to leave you with, as we begin to gather up the threads of this long evening and move toward rest. The people of the 1740s, the 1750s, the 1760s were not simply waiting for us to arrive with our antibiotics and our running water and our germ theory. They were not passive occupants of a deficient world, longing for something they couldn't name. They were people who thought seriously about their bodies, who developed elaborate practices for their care, who passed knowledge between generations with great care and effort, who maintained real and meaningful standards of cleanliness within the constraints of what they had. The linen culture, the careful management of what you wore next to your skin, the monthly washing that required days of labor and genuine skill, the barber who shaved you and served as your neighborhood's medical generalist and social hub, the household recipe book full of preparations that mixed genuine botanical knowledge with beliefs about the body that we'd now consider incorrect, the chamber pot and the night soil man, the herbs dried and stored against the medicine chest's needs, the cold bath taken in the morning as a deliberate act of strengthening the constitution, the spa visited for health and for pleasure, and for the social world that gathered around both. All of this represents a coherent, complex, thoughtful engagement with the challenge of maintaining the human body in a difficult world. Were they wrong about things? Absolutely. The miasma theory was wrong, and the medical practices built on it sometimes killed people who might have lived. The lead in the cosmetics was poisonous. The belief that full-body bathing was dangerous delayed the development of cleanliness practices that would have prevented disease. The management of communal waste in cities was inadequate in ways that caused real suffering. But we need to hold that truth alongside the other truth, which is that we are also wrong about things. Not the same things, different things. The specific errors of any era are invisible to the people living in it, because the errors are embedded in the framework through which they understand the world, and you cannot see the errors in a framework from inside the framework. The 18th century couldn't see the bacteria on the hands of the midwife, because they didn't have a concept of bacteria. We cannot see whatever the equivalent thing is that we're missing, by definition. What we can do, and what I think this kind of history is genuinely valuable for, is to cultivate a certain humility, not nihilism, not the conclusion that nothing we believe is reliable, but the recognition that the people of the past were as intelligent, and as serious, and as genuinely concerned with maintaining the health and comfort of their bodies as we are, and that they were still wrong about important things, which suggests, without much logical difficulty, that we probably are too. The grandmother who made soap from rendered fat and wood ash lye in the autumn, the woman who changed the linen shirts weekly and boiled them in an enormous copper kettle and spread them on the grass to bleach, the barber who shaved the neighborhood's men twice a week and kept the social news of the district flowing along with the lather, the night soil man who came before dawn and took away what the city produced and asked for very little thanks for doing it. All of them were managing, with the resources and knowledge they had, the same fundamental challenge that we manage every day. The body is a difficult thing to maintain. It produces waste and absorbs dirt and hosts parasites and decays in complicated ways. It smells. It needs water and care and attention. The systems we have built to address this challenge, from the ancient linen tradition to the chamber pot to the running water and the sewage system and the soap factory and the germ theory and the antibiotic, are all part of one long, continuous, still unfinished story about what it takes to keep the human body alive and comfortable and tolerable in the company of other human bodies. We are further along in that story than the people of 1740. We have better answers to some of the questions. We have more resources. We have running water and antibiotics and a working understanding of microbial transmission. But we are not at the end of the story. Nobody is ever at the end of the story. So tonight, as you settle towards sleep, with the warmth of your bed around you, and the clean sheets against your skin, and the water that will be there tomorrow morning when you want it, the tap that will turn without any effort on your part, the soap that requires no autumn day of rendering and lashing and careful proportion, let some small part of you hold a quiet recognition. The woman in the colonial kitchen counting her linen shirts and planning the washing day, the apprentice boy running the wig to the wig makers for its monthly cleaning, the barber whose shop smelled of soap in a neighborhood that smelled of almost nothing else, the night soil man making his way through the pre-dawn streets with his cart and his buckets and his essential, invisible, unglamorous service to the city. The sea bather stepping into the cold October water in a heavy flannel gown, believing that the salt and the cold were doing something real to their body, and being in some imprecise but genuine sense correct. They were all working on the same problem that you are working on. They were all doing the best they could with what they had. They were all, in their own ways, taking care of themselves and of each other in a world that offered no guarantees and required constant attention. That is not a small thing. That is, in some sense, the whole of the human story. The body, maintained through effort and knowledge and habit and community, carried through time, changed and changing, understood better and better, but never completely, requiring attention every day. Take care of yourselves tonight. Drink your water, wash your face, pull your clean sheets up around you, and let the day go. The morning will bring its own demands. The body will be there again, requiring its maintenance, offering its small pleasures, doing its complicated work of keeping you alive. You are in good company. The grandmother with her soap pot, and the sea bather in her flannel gown, and the barber, and the night soil man, and the woman at her spinning wheel at 10 at night, and all the rest, across all the centuries, all of them taking care of the body they were given. All of them, in their own way, here with you tonight. And yet, before we truly let the night take us, there is more to this story. There is always more to this story. Because we have spent most of our evening in England and in the American colonies, and the history of hygiene in the 18th century is larger than that. It spreads across Europe in ways that are genuinely different, genuinely surprising, and genuinely worth spending more time with. And it reaches into corners of the domestic world that we haven't yet touched, corners that are sometimes funny and sometimes heartbreaking, and always, always deeply human. So stay with me a little longer. The fire is still going. There is more night left. And what comes next is, I promise you, worth the staying. Let us go to France, because France in the 18th century had a relationship with the body and with bodily care that was simultaneously more elaborate and more contradictory than anything we've discussed so far. The French aristocratic world was the most fashion-conscious, the most aesthetically demanding, the most intensely concerned with the presentation of the self in social spaces of any culture in the Western world at this moment in history. And that obsession with appearance had consequences for hygiene that were not always what you might expect. The court of Versailles, which under Louis XIV had been the centre of the entire European aristocratic world, had established customs and rituals around the royal body that filtered down through aristocratic society in ways that shaped how wealthy people across the continent thought about personal care. The lever, the ritual morning rising of the king, during which the most senior courtiers had the honour of witnessing and assisting in the king's dressing, the watching of a royal face being shaved, the presence at the royal chamber pot. These were not merely ceremonial curiosities. They were the practical expression of a worldview in which the body of the king was a public object, a political object, the object around which the entire social world organized itself. In that world, the intimate care of the body was not a private act. It was a performance, and the performance happened in front of an audience. This had a particular effect on the culture of cleanliness at Versailles and in the aristocratic households that modelled themselves on it. Because if the care of the body is a performance, then what matters most is not what is actually happening to the body, but how the performance looks and smells. The application of perfume matters more than the washing that perfume is supposed to supplement. The freshness of the linen matters enormously because it is visible. The elaborate styling of the hair matters because it is seen. What happens to the scalp underneath the styling is less important because it is not seen. This is not hypocrisy exactly. It is the logic of a world organized around visibility, around the social surface, around the management of impressions, and within that logic, the French aristocracy of the 18th century developed a culture of bodily care that was, in its own terms, extraordinarily sophisticated. The perfumers of Paris in the 1730s and 1740s were producing things of genuine artistry. The trade in aromatic materials, the ambergris and musk and civet and rose and jasmine and violet, and hundreds of other ingredients that went into the great perfumes of the period, was one of the most economically significant luxury trades in Europe. The knowledge of how to combine these materials, how to balance the top notes and the base notes, how to create a scent that evolved over hours as it warmed against the skin, was a genuine craft skill that took years to develop. The Great Nose, as the master perfumer was sometimes called, was a figure of real cultural prestige. The perfumes produced by the houses of Paris were exported to courts across Europe, to England and Spain and Russia and the German states, and wearing a French perfume was a way of announcing your connection to the pinnacle of European fashion. For the woman who wore one of these perfumes, the ritual of application was itself part of the morning toilette, part of the careful assembly of the self that preceded any appearance in the social world. The perfume went on after the linen was changed and the face was attended to and the hair was dressed. It was the final layer, the outermost surface of the social self, the thing that preceded you into a room and followed you out of it. And between all of these layers, between the clean linen and the face treatment and the cosmetic preparations and the perfume, the actual skin of the body was perhaps less attended to than the layers on top of it. The French aristocratic woman of 1740, who was dressed by her maid each morning, who had her face powdered and her hair arranged and her perfume applied, might go a considerable number of days without anything that we would recognize as washing the body beneath all that careful construction. This was not unusual or shocking to her contemporaries. It was the normal management of a body within the available framework. The linen was clean, the exterior was managed, the social self was presented appropriately. What happened between the linen and the skin was, in a practical sense, secondary. Outside the aristocracy, in the bourgeois households of Paris and the provincial cities, the picture was somewhat different. The middling classes of France had their own traditions of bodily care that were less elaborate and less perfumed than the aristocratic world, but not necessarily less attentive in their own way. The French bourgeois household kept its own soap, used its own herbs, maintained its own standards of linen cleanliness, and managed the daily care of the body with the same practical intelligence we see in other European households of the period. There was, in France, a tradition of the bain de pierre, the foot bath, as a regular domestic practice that was somewhat more formalized than in England. The basin of warm water into which feet were immersed was a recognized domestic comfort, prescribed by physicians as a treatment for various ailments and recommended for general maintenance of health. It was a small, manageable version of the full bath, requiring far less hot water and far less labor, and its regular practice was something that even modest households could aspire to. The French also had a well-developed tradition of thermal bathing, the use of naturally occurring hot springs and mineral waters, that was in some ways more integrated into the culture of health than the English equivalent. The great thermal establishments at Vichy and Bourbon-les-Bains and other locations had been in operation since the medieval period, and by the 18th century they were established fixtures of the social calendar for those who could afford them, places where health and society and the pleasures of the body were combined in ways that were seen as entirely normal and entirely respectable. Let us now cross into Germany, because the German-speaking world of the 18th century had its own distinctive approach to the body and to hygiene that is genuinely different from both the English and the French models, and that contributed importantly to some of the ideas that would transform hygiene practice in the following century. The German tradition of the Badestube, the bathhouse, had survived with more vitality than the equivalent English institution. Public bathing establishments, where people could pay for access to hot water and the services of a bath attendant, continued to operate in German towns and cities through the 18th century, serving a function that the English bathhouses had largely abandoned. These were not fashionable places in the way that Bath was fashionable. They were working establishments that served ordinary people who wanted access to hot water that they couldn't easily produce at home. The experience of a visit to a Badestube in the mid-18th century was considerably more prosaic than the elaborate social ritual of Bath. You paid your fee, you were given access to a wooden tub filled with hot water. You washed, you got out. There was none of the elaborate social performance, none of the prescribed therapeutic ritual, none of the architectural grandeur. It was simply a practical service that addressed a practical need. But the existence of these establishments, the fact that they had continued to operate and serve ordinary people, meant that the practice of full-body bathing in hot water remained more familiar in parts of the German-speaking world than in England, and that familiarity would matter when the ideas that would eventually transform European hygiene practice began to develop. Those ideas were already beginning to stir in the German medical world of the 18th century. Physicians and natural philosophers in the German states were among the most active participants in the Enlightenment's project of applying reason and observation to questions of health and the body. The tradition of medical education in the German universities was rigorous and serious, and some of the most important medical thinking of the period came from this world. Johann Peter Frank, a physician who lived from 1745 to 1821, developed what he called a system of medical police, by which he meant a comprehensive framework for public health administration, including detailed recommendations about sanitation, water supply, waste management, and the management of the bodies of the population. Frank's work, published in multiple volumes from 1779 onward, was enormously influential in the German states and beyond, and represented one of the clearest early expressions of the idea that public health was a matter of governance. that the management of the bodies of the population was a legitimate and important function of the state. This idea, which sounds obvious to us now but was genuinely new in its systematic form in the 18th century, would eventually lead to the great public health reforms of the 19th century, the provision of clean water, the construction of sewage systems, the regulation of food and drink. The seeds of all of that were in Frank's work and in the work of others who were thinking similarly in the late 18th century. But let us not get too far into the future. Let us stay with the 18th century for a while longer, because there are things happening in the everyday domestic world of the period that deserve attention. Let us talk about soap more carefully, because soap is really the central character in the story of hygiene, and we have been circling around it without giving it the full attention it deserves. Soap is ancient. The basic chemistry of soap, the reaction between animal fat and an alkaline substance that produces a compound capable of capturing grease and carrying it away in water, was understood in practical if not chemical terms by civilizations as old as ancient Babylon. Soap had been made and used in various forms throughout the ancient world and through the medieval period. By the 18th century, there were already established centers of commercial soap production in Europe, most notably in Marseille in France and in Castile in Spain, where the combination of good olive oil and wood ash lye had produced the white or grey bars of soap that were traded across the continent. But in England and in the American colonies, most household soap was still made at home in the annual autumn production that we visited earlier in the evening, and the quality of this homemade soap was variable, depending on the quality of the fat and the strength of the lye and the skill of the person making it. Good soap, properly made, is a remarkable substance. It works through a mechanism that would not be properly understood until the 19th century, when chemistry developed the tools to explain what the soap molecule actually does. The soap molecule has one end that is attracted to water and one end that is attracted to fat. When soap is introduced to a mixture of water and fatty residue on the skin, the fat-attracted end of the soap molecule surrounds and encapsulates the fat, while the water-attracted end pulls the whole assembly into the water where it can be rinsed away. This is emulsification, and it is why soap removes grease and oil in a way that water alone cannot. In the 18th century, the people making and using soap didn't know any of this. They knew that soap worked, that it cut through grease and removed stains and left things cleaner than water alone. They had been using it for this purpose for centuries. The mechanism was mysterious, but the effect was observable and reliable. The hardness or softness of soap depended on the specific fat used and on the process of making it. Soap made from animal tallow, the rendered fat of cattle and sheep, was harder and more durable than soap made from lard or from vegetable oils. Soap made with potash, the potassium-based alkali produced from wood ash, was softer than soap made with soda, the sodium-based alkali that would later be produced industrially from salt. The soft potash soaps of the colonial kitchen were good for laundry but difficult to store and difficult to use for personal washing in the same way that a hard bar is used. The distinction between laundry soap and the kind of soap suitable for washing the body was already recognized in the 18th century, even if the products weren't always entirely separate. Good soap for washing the face and hands was milder, better made, and often scented with something pleasant, lavender or rose or some other aromatic that masked the faint smell of the fats from which it had been made. This kind of soap was more expensive and therefore more the province of prosperous households. For the very poor, soap of any kind might be used very sparingly, reserved for the most important washing tasks, stretched as far as it would go. The lye water used to make soap, a solution of wood ash in water, was itself a cleaning agent, harsh on hands and fabric, but effective enough for basic purposes. Many households that had not managed to produce a batch of proper soap in a given year, or that had run out before the next production, used lye water as a substitute. The beginning of the commercial soap industry in England, with the production of relatively inexpensive hard soap bars that could be purchased rather than made, was significant. But the soap taxes that kept the price elevated meant that the transformative effect of cheap, accessible soap would not be felt until after those taxes were finally abolished in 1853. What happened to soap consumption in England after 1853 is one of the more striking statistics in the history of hygiene. It essentially doubled within a decade, as soap that had previously been rationed and used carefully became affordable enough to use more freely. But we are still in the 18th century, where soap is a considered resource and its use is deliberate and sometimes parsimonious. Let us think about what all of this meant for the body's daily management, specifically for the working body, the body that was doing physical labor all day and returning to a small, crowded domestic space at night. The laboring body in the 18th century was a body that sweated a great deal. Agricultural work, craft work, domestic service, the carrying of loads through city streets, all of it produced sweat in quantities that the linen shirt could absorb only up to a point. Beyond that point, the shirt became saturated, and the smell of a heavily working body in a heavily worked shirt on a hot summer day was not subtle. This was understood. It was not comfortable, but it was also not, within the prevailing social world of working-class life, necessarily a cause for social shame in the way that body odor is treated now. Working bodies smelled like working bodies. This was the condition of physical labor, and it was recognized as such by everyone who shared the same condition. What changed this, gradually, was not a sudden moral revolution, but the slow accumulation of several things together. The development of urban industrial work, which brought large numbers of people together in factories and workshops and required them to occupy the same spaces in ways that amplified the collective effect of multiple unwashed bodies in enclosed spaces. The development of a middle class with enough time and enough resources to maintain different standards of bodily cleanliness, and therefore to perceive the smell of the working class as distinct and offensive in ways it might not have been when everyone smelled more or less the same. The beginning of germ theory, which connected smell not merely to social class, but to actual physical danger, to disease-carrying contamination, and the beginning of the kind of factory-produced soap that could be afforded by working families. All of these things were converging in the late 18th and early 19th centuries in ways that would produce the modern hygiene culture that we now inhabit. But they were converging slowly, and in the 1740s and 1750s and even the 1770s, the working body was still largely managing itself within the linen framework, the seasonal washing framework, the practical limitations of cold water and expensive soap that had governed it for generations. There is something I want to say about this that risks sounding sentimental, but that I genuinely believe is true and worth saying. The working body of the 18th century was in many respects more in contact with itself than the modern body is, not in a mystical sense, but in a simple physical sense. A person who couldn't easily wash was a person who knew their own body in a direct and immediate way, who felt its changes, who was aware of its condition moment to moment, who had not interposed the daily buffering of hot water and soap and deodorant between themselves and their own skin. This was not comfortable. I am not romanticizing it. But it did mean a different kind of physical self-awareness, a different relationship with the signals the body sends, with the smell and the feel and the condition of the skin and the hair, that some historians have argued we have lost in the transition to our current norms of hygiene. The modern body, thoroughly washed and deodorized and moisturized, is in some respects more hidden from itself. Whether that is a loss worth lamenting is a question I leave to you. Let us now spend some time with something that was one of the great public health challenges of the 18th century city, a challenge whose solution would eventually transform everything, the question of water supply. Every city in Europe in the 18th century faced the same fundamental problem. Cities needed enormous quantities of water for drinking, for cooking, for washing, for the crafts and industries that operated within them, for the horses that powered them, for firefighting, and the technology for delivering that water to where it was needed was entirely inadequate to the demand. London's first serious attempt to address this problem at scale had begun in the 17th century with the New River Company, which cut a channel from springs in Hertfordshire to a reservoir in North London. By the 18th century, several water companies were competing to supply different parts of the city through wooden pipes, but the supply was intermittent, the quality was poor, and the coverage was far from complete. Large parts of the city had no piped water at all. In Paris, the Seine was the primary water source, supplemented by a network of fountains fed from springs. Paris's population had grown to somewhere around 500,000 by the mid-18th century, and the Seine that supplied its water was also receiving its waste, a situation whose public health implications would not be fully grasped for another century, but that produced consequences that were visible in the mortality rates from waterborne disease. The water carriers who walked the streets of Paris and London with their barrels and their cries were not marginal figures. They were essential infrastructure, filling a gap that the official water supply systems could not fill, bringing water to the households and workshops and eating establishments that had no other source. Their work was physically exhausting and socially invisible, and the quality of the water they sold was entirely dependent on where they filled their barrels. The development of steam-powered pumps in the 18th century offered, in theory, a way to solve the water delivery problem at scale. James Watt's improvements to the steam engine, which became commercially practical in the 1770s, made it possible to pump water much more effectively than had been possible before. But the application of this technology to urban water supply was slow and patchy, and the building of comprehensive waterworks that could supply clean water to an entire city was still, in the 1780s and 1790s, largely a vision rather than a reality. What did the inadequacy of water supply mean for the ordinary person trying to maintain themselves? It meant, first and most obviously, that water had to be planned for. You didn't use water casually, you thought about how much you needed, you obtained that amount, and you used it carefully. A household that went to the pump twice a day might obtain enough water for cooking and for basic face and hand washing. To add a more substantial washing of the body would require either more trips to the pump or a deliberate allocation of the water already on hand that couldn't also go to cooking. The economics of water use in the 18th century city was a constant calculation, invisible to us because we never have to perform it, but present for everyone in that world. And the calculation consistently produced, for most people, the answer that the basic and essential uses of water took priority over the additional use of bathing. This is not a failure of character or a deficiency of values. It is simple arithmetic in a world of constrained resources. Now, I want to spend some time with a figure who doesn't always appear in histories of hygiene, but who seems to me genuinely central to the story of how the body was managed in the 18th century, and who connects the world of formal medicine with the world of ordinary domestic practice in ways that are genuinely illuminating. I want to spend some time with the apothecary. The apothecary, in the 18th century, occupied a complicated and important position in the landscape of healthcare. Below the physician in social status, more accessible and less expensive than the physician, the apothecary was, for most ordinary people, the primary point of contact with the formal medical world. The physician, who had a university degree and charged fees that put him beyond the reach of most working people, was consulted in serious illness if he could be reached and if his fees could be paid. The apothecary, who operated a shop in the neighborhood and who prepared and sold the medicines that physicians prescribed, but also provided advice and informal diagnosis on his own account, was there all the time. The apothecary's shop was a distinctive kind of space, fragrant with the smell of the herbs and spices and resins and minerals that lined its shelves in jars and boxes and drawers. The smell of a well-appointed apothecary's shop, the combination of dried lavender and camphor and cloves and various other aromatic substances, was itself understood as having some general beneficial effect on the atmosphere, consistent with the miasma theory. You were, in some sense, breathing medicine just by entering the shop. The apothecary prepared the medicines that physicians prescribed, measuring and grinding and mixing and compounding the ingredients that went into the pills and tinctures and plasters and ointments that formed the pharmacopoeia of the period. This was skilled work, requiring knowledge of the properties of a large number of substances and the ability to manage their preparation accurately. The apothecary who mixed the wrong proportions or substituted an inferior ingredient could cause real harm, and the quality of apothecaries varied enormously. But the apothecary also sold things that were not formally prescribed medicines: tooth powders, hair preparations, cosmetics, the ingredients for household medical preparations that women made at home from their recipe books, soap of better quality than what was made at home, scented water, simple remedies for common complaints, constipation and headache and cough and skin problems that people bought over the counter without any physician's involvement. This part of the apothecary's trade was direct, practical, and deeply connected to the everyday management of the body. The woman who came to the apothecary for rose water and almond oil and beeswax for her face preparation was doing something recognizable and sensible. The man who came for a tooth powder that contained some mild abrasive and something to freshen the breath was addressing a real and immediate concern. The mother who came for something to treat a child's skin rash was doing what mothers have always done, which is seeking help for the bodies in her care when the household preparations hadn't been sufficient. The apothecary was also a source of advice, formal and informal, about what to do with a body that was behaving badly. The symptoms that didn't quite warrant calling a physician, the condition that was uncomfortable but not severe, the question about whether a particular preparation was safe for a pregnant woman or an elderly man. These were the kinds of consultations that took place across the apothecary's counter without being formally recorded anywhere, and without the fees that a physician would have charged. In this way, the apothecary's shop was one of the primary nodes of the practical health knowledge that circulated in 18th century communities. Not the knowledge of the medical schools and the formal texts, but the accumulated, tested, modified, passed-on knowledge of what actually seemed to work in the ordinary management of ordinary bodies in ordinary circumstances. There is one more institution of the 18th century hygienic world that deserves its own careful attention, and that is the laundress. The laundress, in London and in the other cities of 18th century Britain and Europe, was a person who took in other people's washing, the linen shirts and shifts and caps and stockings and table linens and other washable items of a household, and returned them clean. This was a trade, a skilled trade, whose practitioners ranged from women who operated formal establishments with several employees and specialized equipment, to women who took in a few items at a time and washed them in the corner of a one-room dwelling. The laundress's work was the same work that the colonial farm wife was doing on her washing day, but professionalized, carried out by people who did it every day and who had developed the skills and the knowledge that daily practice produces. The best laundresses knew which fabrics required which treatments, how to remove specific stains, how to achieve the bright whiteness that good linen was expected to have, how to starch and press and fold so that the finished articles looked right. They also knew which soaps were appropriate for which fabrics, how much lye water could be used before it damaged the fibers, how long to boil and at what temperature. This was practical chemistry, understood through experience rather than through formal education, but not less reliable for that. The laundress's trade was one of the primary ways in which the linen culture of 18th century hygiene was maintained for households that could afford to pay for the service. A prosperous London family that sent their shirts to the laundress weekly was ensuring that the central hygienic mechanism of their lives, the clean linen that did the work of cleanliness against the skin, was being maintained to a standard that they probably couldn't achieve as efficiently at home. For the laundress herself, the work was physical and unrelenting and hard on the hands and the body, and the payment was generally poor, consistent with the general pattern that essential and unglamorous labor tends to be undervalued in proportion to its essentialness and its unglamorousness. The laundress in the attic room or the damp basement, her hands red and rough from the lye and the hot water, the steam rising around her as the copper boiled, was doing work that made other people's bodies more hygienic, while her own working conditions were not at all conducive to health. This is a thread that runs through the whole history of hygiene, and it deserves to be named directly. The cleanliness of prosperous bodies has, throughout much of history, been maintained by the labor of less prosperous bodies working in conditions that were themselves compromised. The laundress whose hands were damaged by the lye she used to clean the shirts of people who would never meet her. The night soil man whose essential service was invisible until it stopped. The servant who emptied chamber pots and hauled water and tended fires so that the household standards could be maintained. Hygiene has never been purely personal, it has always been social. And the social dimension of hygiene, who does the cleaning, whose labor is required to maintain whose standards of cleanliness, is as much a part of the story as any particular practice or belief or technology. Let us now think about children, because the history of hygiene in the 18th century is not only the history of adult bodies, it is also the history of how people thought about children's bodies, what standards were applied to them, what practices were used on them, and how those practices connected to the broader framework of beliefs about health and the body that we have been exploring. Children in the 18th century were understood, within the dominant medical framework, as bodies that were in the process of forming, of becoming what they would be. The humours that governed adult health were not yet stable in the child's body. The constitution was malleable, susceptible to being strengthened or weakened by the conditions of early life, and this meant that the management of the child's body in infancy and early childhood was understood as enormously consequential for the rest of their life. John Locke's Some Thoughts Concerning Education, published in 1693, was still widely read and influential in the 18th century, and its recommendations about children's physical management set the tone for a great deal of what was practiced in prosperous households. Locke advocated for cold baths for children, for exposure to cold and damp conditions to harden the constitution, for loose clothing that didn't restrict movement or breathing, for simple food and limited sugar. He was arguing against the contemporary tendency to wrap children warmly, feed them rich food, and protect them from discomfort in ways that he believed produced weak, sickly adults. The cold bathing of children was consequently fashionable in progressive households for much of the 18th century, part of a broader program of physical toughening that was believed to build health and character simultaneously. The child who was plunged into cold water regularly, who was not bundled in excessive clothing, who was not indulged with sweets and rich food, was being prepared for a life of health and resilience. Whether the children themselves agreed with this assessment is not recorded. The management of infants' hygiene presented particular challenges that parents and caregivers addressed with the practices available to them. The swaddling of infants, the tight wrapping of the baby's body in long strips of cloth that kept the limbs still and the body contained, was common practice in many parts of Europe, including England, through the first part of the 18th century. The swaddled infant was easier to handle, couldn't move around and get into danger, and was believed by some to encourage the proper straightening of the limbs. Swaddling was also, in a household where supervision of an infant was competing with all the other demands of the day, a practical solution to the problem of keeping the baby in one place. But swaddling had obvious hygienic consequences. The swaddled infant couldn't be easily changed when wet or soiled, and the close wrapping that kept the baby contained also kept moisture against the skin. Nappy rash, in its most basic form, was a well-recognized problem. The preparations used to protect and treat the skin of the swaddled infant included oils and fats applied to the skin and powders used to absorb moisture, essentially the same ingredients that are still used in baby skincare products today for the same reasons. By the middle of the 18th century, swaddling was being criticized by physicians and educational reformers who argued that it was harmful, that it prevented the normal development of movement and caused the very weakness it was supposed to prevent. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his enormously influential educational treatise Émile, published in 1762, mounted a passionate attack on swaddling as contrary to nature and to the healthy development of the child's body. His arguments were widely read and widely discussed, and the practice of tight swaddling declined significantly in the second half of the century, at least in the progressive households that were reading Rousseau. The breastfeeding of infants and the alternative practice of wet nursing, where the mother's milk was supplemented or replaced by the milk of another woman hired for the purpose, was another aspect of infant care with significant hygienic dimensions. Breast milk is genuinely protective against infection, and the practice of wet nursing, which was widespread among the upper classes and even to some extent among the middling classes, placed infants at greater risk from whatever infections the wet nurse might be carrying, as well as exposing them to the risks of variable milk quality and inadequate care. The rate of infant mortality in the 18th century was, by our standards, shocking. The death of young children was a routine experience for families of every social class. In some urban parishes in London, more than half of all children born died before the age of 5. Disease was the primary cause, but the management of infant bodies, the feeding practices, the exposure to cold, the presence of infection in the environments where infants were kept, contributed to the toll in ways that were not understood at the time. What parents knew was that some practices seemed to produce better outcomes than others, even if they couldn't explain why. And the accumulated practical wisdom about infant care, transmitted through the same household book traditions and woman-to-woman networks that transmitted other kinds of domestic knowledge, represented genuine expertise even when its theoretical foundations were inadequate. Let us turn now to something that we have been moving around but haven't addressed directly, which is the hygiene of the mouth in relation to the breath, and what the 18th century understood about why breath smelled the way it sometimes did, and what could be done about it. Bad breath, which physicians in the period called otsina or fetor oris, was recognized as a genuine social problem and as a potential indicator of underlying ill health. The causes attributed to it within the humoral framework were various: corruption in the stomach, problems with the digestion, decay in the teeth and gums, imbalances in the body's internal humors that expressed themselves through the breath. Some of these attributions were closer to correct than others. Tooth decay and gum disease do produce characteristic odors, and the prevalence of these conditions in the 18th century meant that bad breath from this source was genuinely common. Digestive problems, including the kind produced by the diet of the period, which was high in meat and low in vegetables for those who could afford meat, and high in starchy staples for those who couldn't, do affect breath in ways that the physicians were observing, even if their explanations were imprecise. The treatments for bad breath in the 18th century included the tooth powders and preparations we've already discussed, as well as herbal preparations taken internally, decoctions of mint and anise and other aromatic plants that were understood to improve digestion and thereby improve the quality of the breath. Mastic, the resin from the mastic tree, was chewed for its mouth-freshening properties, which it genuinely has in a mild way. Small pieces of candied spices, cloves and cinnamon and cardamom, were consumed after meals, partly for pleasure and partly for the breath-freshening effect that these strongly aromatic substances provided. The breath of someone who was seriously ill with certain diseases had its own recognizable character, and this was something that physicians and experienced nurses and family members could use as diagnostic information. The acetone smell of severe diabetic ketoacidosis, the particular odor of certain liver conditions, the characteristic smell of advanced kidney failure, these were observations that experienced medical practitioners were making even without the biochemical framework to understand them. Let us now consider something that sits at the intersection of hygiene and social life in the 18th century in a particularly interesting way, which is the management of the body in the communal spaces of the period. The tavern, the coffee house, the church, the assembly room, the market, and the theatre. All of these spaces brought large numbers of people together in enclosed environments, and all of them had their own cultures of bodily behaviour and their own specific hygienic challenges. The theatre in 18th century London or Paris or any other major city was a particular kind of environment, crowded and warm and poorly ventilated, where people of different social classes were thrown together in ways that didn't happen in most other settings. The smell of a theatre in the 18th century was considerable. The combination of large numbers of bodies, tallow candles producing smoke and smell, the pits where the poorer audience members stood rather than sat, the galleries where more prosperous audience members sat, but still in considerable proximity to each other, the backstage world of costume and scene painting, all of this combined to produce an environment that would strike a modern person as overwhelming. People brought their own additions to this atmosphere. Oranges, sold by the Orange Girls, who were a distinctive feature of the Drury Lane and Covent Garden theatres, produced their own sharp, sweet, citrus contribution to the mix. Pipe smoke was common. Food was consumed during performances. The theatre was not a hushed, reverential space. It was lively and loud and fragrant in multiple senses of the word. The coffee house, which had developed in England from the mid-17th century and was at its peak of cultural importance in the early to mid-18th century, was a different kind of communal space, more intimate, more focused on conversation and the exchange of news, but still crowded and enclosed and sharing the air among a large number of bodies. The coffee houses of London were sorted by trade and interest, frequented by merchants and lawyers and journalists and politicians and men of letters, and the air of a popular coffee house at the height of business was thick with pipe smoke and coffee steam and the smell of wool coats dried by bodies that had been walking in the London rain. The coffee houses also served as post offices, as banks, as news exchanges, as informal stock markets. Lloyd's of London, the insurance market, began in Edward Lloyd's coffee house in the 1680s. The institutions that would eventually become formal stock exchanges began in coffee houses. The social mixing that happened in these spaces was genuinely important to the functioning of the urban economy, and that mixing happened in conditions of considerable bodily proximity. The church, on Sundays, gathered the neighbourhood together in a space that was often poorly heated in winter and poorly ventilated in summer. The smell of the Sunday congregation in a parish church in a working neighbourhood, after 6 days of physical labour, was something that the various fragrances of incense and candles could only partially address. The Sunday service, like the coffee house and the theatre, was a space where the bodies of the community were in close contact, where the transmission of whatever was currently circulating in the population was facilitated by the very act of gathering together. This is one of the mechanisms through which epidemic disease moved through 18th century populations with such speed and completeness. The routine communal gatherings that brought large numbers of people into the same enclosed space. The church that filled on Sunday morning and then watched several of its congregation die in the following weeks was not the cause of the illness, but it was the vector. The miasma theory that attributed disease to bad air was actually, in this specific context, not entirely wrong in its practical implications. Getting large numbers of people into a poorly ventilated space did increase the risk of disease transmission, even if the mechanism was not corrupted air, but rather airborne or contact transmission of specific pathogens. Now, let us spend a few minutes with the specific practices of the very poor, because the history of hygiene is very often told from the perspective of people who had some resources, some choices, some capacity to maintain standards of care. The history of the body in conditions of genuine poverty in the 18th century is harder to tell, because the poor left fewer records and their conditions received less systematic attention from contemporary observers, but it is essential to the full picture. In the worst districts of London, the rookeries of St Giles and Seven Dials and Whitechapel, human density was extreme. Families of 6 or 8 or 10 people lived in single rooms. Multiple families shared houses that had been built for single families. Cellars that had never been intended for habitation housed people who had nowhere else to go. The air in these spaces was, by any measurement, appalling. Ventilation was minimal. Sanitation was essentially absent in any organized sense, with whatever waste existed being deposited in the shared courts and alleys or collected in cesspits that were rarely emptied. In these conditions, the normal mechanisms of hygienic management that we have been discussing were simply not available. There was no linen to change regularly because there was not enough linen. There was no soap because there was not enough money for soap. There was no clean water because the pumps that served these districts were often shared among hundreds of people and frequently contaminated. There was no privacy for any kind of washing, even if the water and the soap had been available. The bodies living in these conditions were managing within constraints so severe that the very concept of hygienic practice becomes almost meaningless as a frame of reference. This was not choice, this was the condition that poverty produced. And yet, even in these conditions, there were practices and habits and small gestures toward cleanliness that represent a genuine attempt to maintain some aspect of bodily care. Children's faces wiped with a damp cloth in the morning, clothes brushed to remove surface dirt when they couldn't be washed, hair combed even when it couldn't be properly cleaned, small acts of maintenance that cost almost nothing and achieved less than they would have with proper resources, but that represented, nonetheless, a refusal to abandon entirely the care of the body. Henry Mayhew, whose detailed documentary journalism about London's poor in the mid-19th century is our best window into the lives of the very poorest Londoners, records encounter after encounter with people who maintained a kind of fierce dignity about their appearance, even in conditions of extreme deprivation. The costermonger whose coat was patched and worn but clean, the street seller whose face was washed even when her clothes were not, the lodging housekeeper who swept the floor of an establishment that had no beds worth speaking of. These observations come from the 19th century, slightly outside our period, but they describe conditions that had existed in the same districts for generations, and they capture something important about the relationship between poverty and hygiene that transcends any specific decade. The desire to be clean, the aspiration towards some standard of bodily care, did not disappear in poverty. What disappeared was the capacity to achieve it. This is one of the most important things that the history of hygiene can teach us. Cleanliness is not primarily a moral quality. It is not primarily a product of character or values or the will to maintain oneself properly. It is primarily a product of access to water, to soap, to clean linen, to the time and the physical space to wash. When access is there, most people are clean because most people want to be clean, and the barriers to being clean are manageable. When access is not there, people are not clean because the barriers are not manageable regardless of how much they want to overcome them. The 18th century understood this at some level, even if it didn't always articulate it clearly. The reformers who began, toward the end of the century, to argue for improvements in the conditions of the poor, for better housing and cleaner water and less crowded living arrangements, were motivated partly by simple humanity and partly by the growing recognition that the disease that spread from the poor quarters of the city did not respect the social boundaries between those quarters and the prosperous neighborhoods. The typhus that killed the poor in the rookeries could and did spread to kill the comfortable in their better appointed houses. Cleanliness was a collective concern, not just an individual one. This recognition would grow enormously in the 19th century, eventually producing the great sanitary reforms that changed the cities of the Western world. But its seeds were in the 18th century, in the observations of physicians and social reformers who were beginning to connect the conditions of living with the patterns of disease. Let us spend a little time on sleep, because sleep and hygiene are more connected than we usually acknowledge, and the sleeping arrangements of the 18th century had their own hygienic dimensions that are worth understanding. We discussed earlier, in the context of colonial America, the communal sleeping arrangements that were normal for most of the population, the shared beds, the multiple bodies in small spaces, the intimacy of nighttime proximity that was simply the condition of life for most people. The same arrangements prevailed in England and across Europe: the private bedroom, the bed occupied by one or at most two people, the space where sleep was genuinely individual, was a luxury of wealth that the majority of the population did not have. The shared bed had obvious hygienic consequences: skin conditions that were contagious, which in the 18th century included various fungal infections, scabies, and other parasitic conditions that transmitted easily through close skin contact, moved freely through households where several people shared sleeping space. Respiratory illnesses, transmitted through the air breathed by people sleeping in close proximity, spread more efficiently in crowded sleeping arrangements. The tuberculosis, that was one of the great killers of the 18th and 19th centuries, was transmitted in exactly this way, through the shared air of enclosed spaces, and it thrived in the overcrowded homes of the working poor. The bedding itself required its own management. The feather mattress and the wool blankets that provided warmth accumulated, over time, the sweat and shed skin of everyone who slept on them, and they attracted the various parasites that found this environment congenial. The regular airing of bedding, taking it outside on fine days and exposing it to sunlight and fresh air, was standard household practice in prosperous homes, and the sunlight genuinely did help, for the same reasons that sunlight bleached and refreshed linen. But in crowded urban dwellings with no outdoor space, this option was limited. The washing of bedding was a separate and major undertaking from the regular washing of linen clothes. Heavy wool blankets and feather quilts couldn't be treated the same way as a linen shirt. They couldn't be boiled without damage. They required different techniques and different resources. In practice, bedding was washed much less frequently than clothing, and in poorer households, it might go years between washings, with the inhabitants relying on the airing that was possible and accepting the parasites and accumulations that resulted as simply part of the condition of sleeping. This is one of the areas where the history of hygiene connects most directly to the history of skin disease and parasitic infestation, which were genuinely common at every level of society, but most prevalent where sleeping conditions were most crowded and most difficult to maintain. Scabies, the intensely itching infestation caused by a mite that burrows under the skin, was so common in the 18th century that it was sometimes called the itch without any more specific name, as if the condition was so universal that no further identification was needed. It spread through shared bedding and clothing, and through the close physical contact of communal sleeping and the preparations used to treat it. Sulfur-based preparations applied to the skin were effective in ways that the people using them probably didn't fully understand, because sulfur kills the mite, and killing the mite is the only thing that actually helps. Let us move toward the close of this evening by spending some time with something that is perhaps the most personal and the most private aspect of 18th century hygiene, and that is also the aspect that most directly connects the practices of the past to the sensory experience of the present. I want to talk about scent more fully and more honestly than we have yet. The 18th century's relationship with smell was different from ours in ways that are genuinely hard to imagine from inside our thoroughly deodorized world. The range of smells that were present in everyday life was vastly greater than what we experience. The smells of animals, of food in various stages of preparation and decay, of the human body in its natural condition, of damp wool and tallow smoke and horse dung and the river and the earth, all of these were present constantly and unavoidably in ways that made the developed sensitivity to smell that we saw in the history of perfumery not a luxury, but a genuine daily necessity. Learning to distinguish smells, to read what they meant, to respond appropriately to the information they carried, was a survival skill in a world where smell was one of the primary ways in which the health of food, the safety of water, the condition of a wound, or the severity of an illness was assessed. The physician who visited a patient in the 18th century was using their nose as a diagnostic instrument. The smell of the sick room, the breath of the patient, the odor of any discharge or excretion, these provided information about what was happening inside the body that experience and careful attention could translate into something actionable, even within the limited framework of humoral medicine. The midwife and the experienced domestic nurse were similarly attentive to smell as a source of information. The smell of an infected wound is specific and recognizable, and the women who spent their lives attending to bodies in their most vulnerable moments were developing through experience a practical knowledge of what smells meant and what they called for, even without the theoretical framework that would eventually explain them. This olfactory sophistication, this ability to read the world through smell, was something that the culture of perfumery both expressed and extended. The perfumer, who could distinguish 200 separate aromatic ingredients by smell alone, who could identify the specific character of each and predict how it would behave in combination with others, was applying a capacity for olfactory discrimination that was, in its broader form, one of the primary sense capacities of the pre-industrial world. We have, to a significant degree, lost this capacity, or at least atrophied it, through the management of smell that our own hygiene culture has produced. We live in a world from which most organic smells have been removed or replaced with artificial fragrances so thoroughly that our ability to distinguish and read natural smells has become, for most of us, quite limited. This is not entirely a loss. The smells that have been removed include many that were genuinely harmful, that were carriers of disease in both the metaphorical and the literal sense. But it is worth acknowledging that something genuinely was lost, a kind of sensory engagement with the world that we have traded for a different kind of comfort. The aromatic world of the 18th century, the lavender sachets in the linen press, the smell of beeswax on polished wood, the fragrance of rosewater on a cleaned face, the sharp, clean smell of freshly washed and dried linen, the warm, complex smell of a barber's shop, the green smell of fresh herbs drying in a kitchen, these were not merely pleasant. They were the texture of daily life, the sensory fabric of what it felt like to be alive and cared for and present in the world. And I find myself, as the night deepens around us and we move towards sleep, wanting to hold on to that for a moment. Not the disease and the parasites and the lead in the cosmetics and the wrong theories about the pores, those are real and important, and we have spent time with them honestly, but also the other thing, the genuine beauty that existed in the material culture of care that the 18th century developed, The careful hands of the laundress producing white linen from grey, the barber's lather on a cold morning face, the small jar of cold cream on the dressing table in the candlelight, the lavender hanging in bundles to dry in a kitchen window. People were taking care of themselves and of each other, with what they had, as well as they knew how, in conditions that were often genuinely hard, and the care was real even when the knowledge was incomplete. The love expressed through the prepared medicine and the changed linen and the drawn water and the tended fire was not diminished by the fact that the theory behind it was sometimes wrong. Care is not the same as knowledge. Care is older than knowledge, and it will outlast it. And the 18th century, for all its ignorance of germ theory and its wrong ideas about miasma and its lead-based cosmetics and its shared beds full of parasites, was as full of care as any other century, perhaps more visibly so, because the care was more direct, more physically present, more obviously labor-intensive. You could see the effort. You could see it in the red hands of the laundress and the calluses of the woman who drew water, and the practiced efficiency of the midwife and the careful fingers of the barber. The care was not hidden behind infrastructure and not outsourced to systems and institutions that made it invisible. It was right there, in the hands of the people doing it. There is something in that directness, that visibility, that I find genuinely moving and genuinely worth noticing as we prepare to close this long and wandering evening. The woman in the colonial kitchen making soap from fat and ash and water, doing the chemistry she couldn't name. The man in the barbershop chair, his face in another man's careful hands. The child at the pump in the early morning, filling the bucket that would serve the household's daily washing. The night soil man in the pre-dawn streets, carrying away what the city could not face in daylight. The apothecary grinding tooth powder behind his counter. The smell of his shop a constant mild reminder that someone was paying attention to the business of keeping bodies going. All of them part of the same long, still continuing story of the human body in the world, trying to keep itself clean, trying to keep itself healthy, trying to manage the gap between what it is and what it would like to be. You are in that story too. We all are, every day, in the shower and at the sink, and in the ordinary maintenance that we perform so automatically that we have almost forgotten it is something we do, something we choose, something that required centuries of learning and failing, and learning again before it became as easy as turning a tap. So tonight, as you finally genuinely close your eyes, carry a small and quiet gratitude for the generations who worked on this problem before you, who boiled the linen and ground the tooth powder and hauled the water and kept the fire going and tended the bodies in their care with everything they had. They got a great deal wrong, but they were trying to get it right, and the trying was real, the care was real, the hands were real, as are yours. Sleep well, my friend. The night is yours now. Breathe it in, gently, completely, all the way to the bottom. Tomorrow will bring its own demands. The body will be there again, as it always is, asking for its maintenance, offering its small pleasures, doing its quiet work of keeping you here. You are not so different from the woman at her fire in 1743, or the man in the barber's chair in 1756, or the child at the pump in the cold early morning of 1761. You are all, in the end, just bodies in the world, trying to stay, and that is enough. That has always been enough. Good night.